Okay, so I just want to make sure, can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at any time along the way. But like I said, when we came in, we're talking about new foods and wild foods. And when we're thinking about our designs and thinking about permaculture on our sites, part of that process, and some of you have already done it, and some of you are going to do it, is thinking about the plants that we want to start inviting into our site. And we do kind of a wish list of all the different plants we would want to bring. And one question is, when we're looking at this plant selection, and some of them might be pollinator plants, some of them might just be beautiful flowers, some of them might be plants that are already there. As you're doing your site assessment, you're noticing which ones of these plants are edible. And when we think about the edible plants, sometimes we begin by thinking about the typical garden plants. We think about the tomatoes, we think about the cucumbers, the onions, things like that, that we're really used to eating for most of us. And a lot of what we have become accustomed to eating, and this is definitely not speaking for everybody, but for a lot of people, it is a fairly narrow selection of foods. And that is mostly because we're living in the legacy of industrial farming, which has a lot of monocropping involved, where it's one crop on a large scale. So when we think about our diet, sometimes the foods that we're most familiar with are actually a fairly small selection of foods. But when we think about the natural world and we think about optimum diet, one of the main things actually is diversity, having the most diverse plants that we can. So what are the foods that are growing around us? What do they look like? What kind of forms do they come in terms of the berries on the trees, in terms of the leaves on the trees, the roots of different plants, the seeds, the grasses? So one of the greatest things when we're thinking about new foods and exploring wild foods is which plants are here already. Going out onto your site and really paying attention to what and who is already growing around you. And in that process, we begin to learn how to eat our weeds, the quote unquote weeds. That's a term. I don't know how many of you like that term and how many of you have a problem with that term like I do, the term weeds. So what is a weed? Ralph Waldo Emerson, he says, a weed is simply a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. And I find that to be a really inspiring way to think about plants that I have as a farmer for many years. There are many plants that I just knew of as weeds. And when I began to change the way I thought of these plants and learn about them in different ways, the concept of them as this this evil weed really radically shifted, and my relationship to those plants shifted. And I feel like probably some of you know what I'm talking about and have had that type of experience as well. So when we're thinking about the weeds, or when we're thinking about the wild plants that are growing around us, what are some of the benefits of leaning into them when we're having conversations around gardens, around food security, around food abundance and resilience? The perennials and the wild foods, they have many benefits to them. They're low to no maintenance. They're incredibly easy to grow because they're growing themselves. They are almost all incredibly rich in nutrients. So a lot of the quote unquote superfoods that there's been, have become fashionable in the last decade or so, a lot of those are actually incredibly abundant wild foods from different places around the world. So when we think about, well, what are the foods growing near us? Some of the foods in my region anyway that are considered and have been termed weeds, like stinging nettle, lamb's quarters, purslane, chickweed, these are all some of the most nutrient dense foods and can be considered actually our local superfoods. So which ones are those that you have around you? When we start leaning into the wild foods around us and thinking about foraging as well as a concept of growing in our garden, we start tapping into the diversity of the ecosystem. And in fact, we start really appreciating, or being invited to appreciate the diversity of the ecosystem that much more. We have more opportunity for diversity in our diets. So instead of just the foods that we would normally find at the grocery store or at a typical annual veggie farmers market. We're actually starting to diversify our diets by even just snacking and grazing a little bit from some of the greens or some of the wild onions or the berries that are growing around us. We're starting to allow for a diversity in our diet, which is a very beneficial thing for us. And of course, the taste. This is one that I want to circle back to with everybody because I'm very curious about people's experiences with wild foods and the taste, the flavors. Myself, I've never tasted anything as good as a wild strawberry.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, wild blueberries, some of the pines that we have around here in teas and as flavoring are incredible. So the taste of wild foods can just be phenomenal. And that has, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are because they're not necessarily all in super rich soils or having a lot of tending, they're actually developing a lot more of their secondary metabolic pathway phytochemicals. And those provide a lot of things like volatile oils, which end up as the scents and the flavors of the foods. So wild foods naturally adapt, they become more resilient, and some produce a lot more flavor. So that's a pretty exciting thing. Wild foods, of course, also allow for a deepening of connection to the land. So by allowing nature to provide, by going out and accepting who's here, what do these plants have to offer me in terms of foods and medicines, we actually have this amazing opportunity to start building a relationship with the land and designing our gardens, designing our permaculture spaces to invite in a lot of the different plants that are here and create relationships with them in a really beautiful way. We also, of course, have the benefit of abundance. So we're thinking of wild foods. One of the really important things to think about is which plants are doing really well here. Which plants maybe are actually could be termed quote unquote invasive plants. In my area, there's ones like dandelion that have grown prolifically and have been considered, you know, the top weeds. They're a really, really great one to start with in terms of wild harvesting and building those relationships to our wild foods because they're so abundant. So when we're thinking about wild harvesting, of course, with the wildlands around us, we want to be grazing and really practicing a lot of ethical harvesting. So making sure if it's a native plant or if it's a plant that's very rare, that maybe we don't touch that plant or we don't eat it until we have a very good understanding of how to harvest it, how to work with it respectfully. So as we're thinking about wild foods, I really want to bring that aspect in to the conversation, and we can definitely touch on that more as a group if we need to in terms of what is ethical harvesting. So when we're thinking about the wild foods in our design, of course, thinking about, again, going out, noticing what or who is growing around you, properly IDing. I don't know if any others like you have a guidebook, kind of like Fleur was showing at the beginning today, or some type of plant ID book. Those can be amazing, not only for our basic botany skills and actually being able to understand like leaves as they are in terms of when they're opposite versus alternating up a stem and things like that, flower shapes. Using ID books are amazing. I know there's lots of apps out there as well that are really good, but there's nothing, in my opinion, like a good ID book because you actually have to follow the key and learn who the plant is by looking at it and identifying it that way. So making sure when you're harvesting wild foods, the proper ID is key. And also becoming aware if there's any toxic plants in your area. What are the ones that do have a high toxicity? There are plants that are dangerous to eat. They're usually like on the rare side, but it's a really important first step when you're thinking about wild foods to become familiar with the ones not to eat. And also, what are the lookalikes? Who are look similar? And if you don't have the capacity or ability to really confidently ID it, a plant, maybe wait for until next time. And this is another reason why learning from connecting to our neighbors, talking to our elders, having study groups, having foraging groups, learning together as community can be such a wonderful thing. Because if you're not sure, I bet somebody around you knows. And then thinking about which parts are edible. So there's lots of plants that you can find in an ID book, and it'll say this is an edible plant. And this is a really great example of one that I have around here. This is fiddleheads. And these are actually the baby ferns. And every spring, the ferns open and they unfurl. And at a certain point, they are an incredible spring green. They're so good to forage and eat. But once they start leafing out, they start producing a little bit of a toxicity, not so good to eat anymore. So which parts are edible? When do we harvest? These are all questions that we can begin to ask as we're going out and noticing what plants are around us. And one of the best guides, if we're feeling lost, is which plants were traditionally eaten here. That's going to help bring you to solid ground in this world every single time. Which ones are the traditional foods? How were they harvested? When were they harvested? And how are they prepared? This will not only give us good ideas for recipes, but often there's combinations that allow the nutrients of the food to be unlocked even more, such as using olive oil and tomatoes together. This is a great way of unlocking a lot of those nutritional benefits of the food. Those traditional food combinations are so important. And then also thinking about them in your design. So when you're noticing them in your space, oftentimes there's a tendency to be like, okay, well, take all of those weeds out and put the new plants in that we would like. And when we're thinking about permaculture design and approaching it with a permaculture perspective, taking time to observe and then interact is really key. How are the plants behaving? How are they behaving with each other? Are they competing or are they complementing each other? If you have some roots here, would it be possible to put an aerial or a vine in, or another layer of your food forest in to this area, so that you're not actually competing, so that you're working with what is already existing here? And also, one of my favorite things when we're thinking about wild foods in this way is if I'm about to plant a few things and I have to clear a bit of space for them, it's just usually such a great time to then ID and say, who are these plants? Are they edible? Here's my lunch now. I've not just necessarily weeded the bed, I've also harvested. And then this is bonus. What are the plants telling us about the soil? Wild plants are so incredible in this way. And the more we get to know them and build relationships with them as food, the more we start to be able to benefit from them in other ways in terms of what they can communicate to us. A lot of times, different quote unquote weeds will come in as pioneer species after disturbance, or they'll tell us something else about the soil, such as maybe there's too high potassium, there's too high nitrogen in the soil. You'll have certain plants for different reasons, and they'll tell you a lot about the quality of the soil that you're working with. So Charles Walters, he's the author of the book Weeds, How to Deal with Them Without Pesticides. And he's got a great quote, which is that weeds are an index of what is wrong and sometimes what is right with the soil. So thinking about them as indicator species as well. So again, thinking about our design, thinking about the abundance that we can create in an ecosystem style of gardening, of allowing for what is to flourish, of nurturing and working with nature. What kind of diversity of harvest and abundance of harvest can we start enjoying when we start enjoying the wild foods in our environments? Which ones are abundant for all of us? Which ones can we share together? What kind of recipes? How do we cook them? How do we connect with the land even more? Feel that connection, feel that enjoyment of being a part of the ecosystem that we belong to. And which ones serve different functions? The wild seeds and nuts are just such a beautiful ones of providing long storage, a rare thing in that they have high fat volumes, high protein volumes, and just what kind of enjoyment can we have overall with the wild foods from our landscape? So I'll just end this presentation with this quote. It is that eating wild foods teaches us to live more sustainably in our cities and garner a healthy relationship with the environment. Foraging, in essence, invites us to observe nature's cycles and pay attention to what's in season. This allows us a deeper understanding of our surroundings and guides us to become better stewards of the land, meaning there is a greater likelihood that we will work hard to protect it. So that's amazing herbalist and forager Bronwyn Erickson. And now I'm curious, I'm going to turn it back to our group and ask, what new and wild foods are you curious about? Which ones have you explored? And what recipes have you been tapping into or looking and interested in trying in this new year? And for those of us that are listening to the recording later, I just offer you to share and hive. I mean, and for all of us gathered here too, this is such a great thing for us to be sharing together. Which wild foods have we tried? Which ones are really good? Are there recipes that are worth trying and worth sharing?